Hello, welcome to the Tour of Pleasure here in the Enchanted Kingdom of Hermione. I'm the Lord Chamberlain of the Enchanted Kingdom, Zipgun, and I'm going to continue in my survey of books about the music business and variants thereof. I got the big pile here. I did the books that I've got about labels, which are basically histories of labels. Did those. I did the books about the guys that ran the labels, or at least most of the ones I've got, I think. I've been finding them here and there. I keep forgetting what I've got. My books aren't in the kind of order my CDs are, so. And today I wanted to cover a small selection of books made by the guys who make the music. By which case, I don't mean the musicians. There's lots of books on them. But I mean the record producers, essentially, and the whole machinery of making these things. And I got a couple, actually, well, not that many, but a couple that I've recently picked up that are worth reading. First one I'm going to get to is Maximum Volume, The Life of George Martin, Beatles producer. Important thing, the early years. Note 1966 is the cutoff date. Now, you'd think, not so great. I fervently hope there's a volume 2, because this is really interesting. George has had, I should say, an extremely wide and varied career. And this is really well written. It's really well researched. Sympathetic to the man. He's an easy guy to like. Like I say, I'm really hoping for a volume 2, because I really want to read about his studio in Montserrat and the subsequent volcano that wiped it out and all that stuff. Interesting book, though, and it's not really just about the Beatles at all. This covers the era up to the Beatles and kind of pokes its nose into it. Highly recommended if you're a Beatle nut, but highly recommended if you are a recording enthusiast. This is not that old. A couple of years. I bought it new. Ooh, $40 it says here. I might have paid that. Not too bad though. Another newer one, and I bought this. This was cheap. I think it was like $25. $20. Ted Templeman. Now, Ted Templeman is famous, if you don't know this. Let's see, probably most famous for Van Halen. Previous to that, he was very famous for the Doobie Brothers. He really helped the Doobie Brothers make it to stardom. And Van Morrison, prior to that, he was in the, Harper's Bazaar, and helped produce those hits. Feeling Groovy, and a few others. I think he produced Come to the Sunshine, which was a Van Dyke Farks song. And he basically morphed as a pretty young guy into a Warner Brothers staff producer, if you will. And in the early days, kind of cut his teeth on things like Sailin' Shoes by Little Feat, which is my favorite Little Feat record. And the possible reason I bought this book, really, he produced the absolutely classic album Clear Spot by Captain Beefheart and the Magic Band, a record which inexplicably failed to sell despite Templeman fulfilling his mandate like nobody else. And it's a really good record. It's not really a lot in the book about that. It was a difficult record to make, as you can imagine. And as the book goes on, it goes into stuff that I'm less and less interested in. It goes quite deeply into Van Halen. It's very interesting. One thing I really enjoy about this is he gives a lot of credit to his engineer, Don Landee. He was one of the first people to make sure his engineer got credits on the labels of the record, so I love the guy. He's a good soul. He became an executive in Warner Brothers. He got fairly high up the corporate ladder. Like everybody that went that high up the corporate ladder, he suddenly got fired, and now I'm not sure what he does. But I don't think he has to worry, because he got points on all those records he did, and I sure hope he saved his money. Like so many of the people in this business, he had was it an alcohol problem? which he has conquered, and he seems to be pretty happy. This book is a pretty happy memoir. I was glad to buy it. It was well worth reading. One I don't have here, I can't find it. I've also got a book by Phil Ramone, which I found really dull because, again, there's nobody that Phil Ramone has worked with that really knocks me out. Other than, of course, he did one record with Sonny Chirac, which, needless to say, isn't mentioned in the book. Well, that's how it goes. Finally, next. Now we got a couple of books here. These are interesting. These are about the machinations of the business itself. And this one is pretty famous. Somebody gave me this a while back. Hitman. Now, this is about a thing that they called the network. And the network was, to put this in really short version, it was a group of publicists who managed to get airplay for records if you gave them enough money, which is, a lot like payola, but we don't call it payola, and therefore it was kind of legal. And it was so pervasive in the industry. One of the very famous things that kind of blew this whole thing open was that when Pink Floyd did The Wall and they booked a tour where they only played, I think it was, 2 cities? They played LA for 4 nights or something. And this was a big deal. And The Wall was a big deal. And they put a single out from The Wall, and they label head at CBS, who was, I think, the cashier. The network was like, well, it's going to cost us some money to get that on the radio. He goes, like hell, it's Pink Floyd. Are you kidding? And so he told them to fuck themselves. And I really admired him for this. And, well, but this is the music business. So the network closed ranks, and you wonder how they enforced this. They managed to prevent another Brick in the Wall from being played on any radio station in Los Angeles immediately before Pink Floyd put 4 concerts there. This is clout that I just don't want to know about. And ultimately they caved, and they paid the network, and, the rest is history, blah, blah, blah. But this is a really good book. They were essentially mobsters, and it still kind of exists, I think. I'm not, a couple of these guys were kind of bad people. I mean, there was, and of course, the record companies, because everybody's looking for the advantage. When one company said, we're not going to pay these guys anymore, everybody else goes, great, we will. And of course, it made a difference. So it's a depressing book, but anybody who has any inkling of, for instance, working in this terrible business, you want to read this. And this is pretty old news. Like I say, it's The Wall. I'm sure there are variations of it today. There's always been some kind of, in the music business. But this was particularly blatant, and it was like that example of The Wall made me laugh. Because I thought, if they can freeze out Pink Floyd, in those circumstances, they can do anything. Now, here's a book I dug out of my archives. I've had this book forever, and it's so old that I've lost the dust jacket. Whoops. Well, it's a softcover. But it's a book called The Star Making Machinery. By, what the hell's the guy's name? Now, this book is really interesting. It is completely dated. Jeffrey Stokes. Vintage Books, Division of Random House. This book is, what year is this? 75? 77. 76, he wrote it. Now, Stokes decided he was going to plot a journey through the business of one band making one record. And this could be not a very interesting book, except that he picked a really good example. Oh, they got blue Shimays back in. Yes. For his test study, Mr. Stokes picked the band Commander Cody and his Lost Planet Airmen. Now, this was an interesting choice because in 1976, Commander Cody were a pretty strong live act. They weren't huge. They had been part of the San Francisco sort of stoner country scene, if you will. New Riders. And they shared management with New Riders of the Purple Sage. And they got signed to a label called Famous Music, which didn't really have a label. And they put stuff out on Paramount Records because they had been bought by Gulf and Western, who had bought Paramount Pictures. And so Paramount Records, which was this kind of no-hope label that mostly put out soundtracks, Anyway, they picked up Commander Cody and they put out their first record, and they just happened to have, just out of the gate, a huge single with Hot Rod Lincoln, which everybody's heard. Fabulous single, really good record. Commander Cody records are good. But they put out 4 records for this sad sack label, and they never repeated the success of Hot Rod Lincoln. They produced all their own records, which maybe wasn't such a good idea. I think the second record was a live record, which is good, but it's sort of dim sounding. I mean, there's lots of try, but they just couldn't kind of, get there again. And part of it is because what they were playing was a pretty unfashionable thing. It was kind of like stoner western swing, jazz, country rock. And they were good at it. And they didn't do a lot of originals, but when they did Stems and Seeds again, it's one of their great originals. Anyways, by the time they were getting to the end of this record deal, their label was wobbling. And ultimately, their label got bought by ABC, which I've mentioned in a previous video. ABC were still trying to make a go of it in the record business. So they had bought a whole bunch of labels, and they bought Famous because Famous owned Dot Records, and Dot was still a pretty strong country label. So they bought all of this, and then they sort of went, okay, well, you guys owe us another record. And then there was a contractual problem. Maybe the label hadn't picked up the option in time. It was sort of in debate. And their management had decided they were going to try and hire a producer because they figured a producer might get them back into the big leagues. And so this book is basically about them approaching this crossroads in their career, getting into all kinds of legal problems. It goes into the things like the album advance and a lot of the nuts and bolts of the industry at the time, some of which pertains to today, some of which doesn't. Basically, the long and the short of it was that they got a release from ABC. They weren't going to re-sign with ABC anyways. ABC finally, I don't know what happened. Basically, they said, fine, go. So they were free to sign with Warner Brothers, which is where they wanted to go. Warner Brothers gave them a much larger advance. Warner Brothers okayed the producer, and they picked a producer named John Boylan. And John Boylan is not super well known, but he was the guy who put the Eagles together to back up Linda Ronstadt, amongst other things. And he produced The Association, and he produced, who else? He was a pretty well-known commercial producer. He was his own man, like John Boylan Incorporated. He signed on to this project without them having a label, really, without them having funding secure. And then they went into the recording studio, record plant, I think, in Sausalito, and they didn't have funding secured. And everybody else sort of went, well, we know their manager. We know they're good for it. We don't do this normally because you just don't do this. In the music business, you don't do that. It's stupid. But there you go. And they do it, and finally it all comes out in the wash. Warner's comes in. That's great. They now can go in, they record the record. Boylan produces it. I'm rereading this now. If I remember correctly, then the book goes on to, okay, now the record's done. They get a cover. They make the cover. They pick a single. They put the single into whatever high rotation, promoting the single, etc., etc. And the whole thing is about this one album. Now, as history will show you, this album didn't really set the world on fire. It kind of did more of the same. And they kind of, and I think they were on Warner's for a while. But as a great study of just like one slice of a band's career, it's really, really informative. And it's really well written. It gets bogged down in technical stuff sometimes, but it can't really be helped. But if you can find this, I don't know how hard this book is to find. If you find it in a thrift store or something, it's worth reading if you are, like me, study the record industry, particularly the old record industry. Finally, and this book doesn't fit into anything, but I just bought it. It just came out. It got a lot of buzz. I had to buy it. I bought it for full pop because I bought it from an independent bookstore. It's on an independent publisher. And that book is Earth to Moon by Moon Zappa. Now, there are a lot of books about Frank Zappa. The one I don't have at hand is Freak Out by his former secretary, whose name escapes me, Pauline something or other. And that was not, it was sort of a kiss and tell, but it was not really because she's British and they're above that. And it was a pretty informative book about the inner workings of the Zappa home, which is where this young lady did most of her secretarial work. And she was with Frank for a pretty good long time, all through the Mothers of Invention era. And that book is worth reading if you're a total nut for Zappa, and I'm sort of am. It's worth reading. I don't know if it's worth paying for. This book is a whole different kettle of fish. This is inside the Zappa household. It's not a really pretty place. It's not the horror show that you were kind of fearing, but it doesn't sound like it was very much fun. Moon grew up in a very alternative family where there was considerable infidelity. There was always people around the house. Dad worked in the basement. Don't go bother him. He's got stuff to do. But it covers some very interesting things that I'd never really thought about. And one, of course, is the Valley Girl thing, where Moon legendarily sent a letter to her father on the bedroom door. Dear Frank, my name is Moon. I'm your daughter. I'd like to do something with you. And during some of their rare interactions around the family dinner table, she was doing imitations of her friends at school, talking Valley speak, and Frank thought this was very funny. So he got a bright idea. He was going to write a song about it. And so, of course, in the middle of the night one night, he wakes Moon up. Come on downstairs. I want to do something with you. She's thrilled. Oh, got to work with Dad. I think she's maybe 13 or so at the time. And they do Valley Girl. And wouldn't you know it, it turns into the biggest hit of the man's career. Moon is suddenly hauled in to do promo for it. They're on Letterman. They're all over the place. And it's overwhelming. And, and the other thing is that she starts to kind of figure that Dad is just a little bit resentful because this silly song that his daughter kind of cooked up has turned into his biggest hit. And it's not, Frank has orchestral works in him and much more important things that nobody gives a damn about. But they go and buy a stupid song about the Valley Girls. And there's a little bit of a needle in there with Frank. And Frank, he was a complicated guy. The short review of this book, I think, is perfect. Ariel Levy, author of the, what is it, the abbreviated what? L? With unflinching detail and sharp, witty prose, Moon captures both the specificity and universality of an aloneness that comes from being raised by narcissists. And that is it in a nutshell. Frank comes out looking not great. Gail comes out looking worse than not great. Moon deals with both of their demises with real kind of grace. And she's done a million interviews for this, which are sometimes a little bit tough. She even does one with her brother aaaaand, which kind of doesn't really go anywhere. She was famously locked in all kinds of legal battles with her brothers because Gail made the will unequal between them and, just was really fucked about it. She doesn't seem to hold any grudges. She clearly has been badly screwed up by her upbringing. She was really a sort of a nerdy, prudy kind of kid. You'd think a kid growing up in that atmosphere would be wilder than anything, but in fact, she's the opposite. And there's lots of talk about thinking you're ugly, having hairy legs and having acne and being a 14-year-old girl obsessed with Bon Jovi. So it's a great story that gives you some perspective into what it's like to be a famous person's kid when that famous person is totally bizarre and off the wall, and it's their career to be that bizarre, off the wall character. And I recommend it to anybody interested in Zappa, and I recommend it to anybody who's interested in that kind of thing, the children of celebrities kind of angle, because it's a very good book, much better written than I expected. I expected it to be kind of a kiss and tell horror story. It's not. She clearly loves her family, despite all the stuff that went down, and she's not bitter about it. Some of the books I've read have some really bitter stuff in them. Not this book. It's good. I'm glad I bought it. I'm going to give it to the Emperor of Love, who is my Zappa expert friend. So he doesn't have to shell out $40 for it. But glad I bought it. So there you go. That's part 3 of the books. I think that's it for the books. I don't think there's any more I'm going to talk about. Next, I'll talk about other more musical things. But thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe and list and whatnot. And we'll talk to you anon. Take care of each other. Hug your friends. We'll talk to you later. Bye.